Hello everyone, I'm Michael, and today, I'm going to tell you a story. What is the most taboo thing you've done? Story 1. When I was at uni, between 18 to 20, my landlady, late 40s, early 50s maybe, offered me a reduced rent for favors. I accepted the offer. It was only about once a month or so, but I'd get a few days taken off the monthly rent in exchange for a couple of hours in her bedroom. Seemed like a good deal at the time, and I've got no regrets. She was a single, divorced, I think, woman in her prime. I have happy memories of her making me fried breakfast, and of one of her cats having kittens in my bedroom. It was 30 years ago. I remember her being fun and flirty and the only maid I told, at the time, being incredibly jealous. I can't remember how much my rent was, but I was single and renting a room in her house. She was attractive and friendly, and was good company. My wife describes me as a teenage sex worker, and I suppose this fits the definition. As for the couple of hours, it would involve chatting about life, laying in bed smoking cigarettes, drinking a cup of tea and then being intimate, maybe more than once. I was young. I'm watching my language here. My wife may well read this. Story 2. My dad passed away in April and he had a cat he loved more than life. She was 16 years old and followed him within 4 weeks. I had her cremated, put in a biodegradable urn, and went to my pop's grave. My sis and I pretended to be planting some new flowers and we snuck the cat's urn under the plant, about 4 feet deep. I hope they're chilling together again like they used to. She was a rescue. They found her in the wilderness, almost starved to death. She was tiny, and the name given to her by the shelter was Mary, which my dad hated for a cat name. So from that day forth she was called Maisie, a general cutesy term for cat in German. Of course, she didn't care either way, and only showed up when you shook treats in a box or when my pop settled down with a blanket on the couch to have his evening latte, nightly episode of a dozen or so crime comedy shows he enjoyed. Re this being taboo. I'm from a small town in Bavaria. If you're German, you probably know that we're sort of the Texas of Germany, and we have a lot of very Catholic people, especially the elderly and especially in smaller towns or villages. We checked with my nana before burying the cat because it mattered to us that it didn't offend her. She loved it, but a lot of our older relatives were even gossiping about us putting little cat figurines on the grave because they feel it is inappropriate. Obviously, it's also forbidden by the graveyard themselves. But I chatted up one of the gardeners they have there, and he said worst case, we'll get a slap on the wrist and a small fine. He only emphasized that the urn needs to be made from organic and biodegradable material. My dad was a very unconventional guy with a wicked sense of humor. Unfortunately, his kidneys died due to a hereditary condition. None of us have it, thank God, when he was in his mid-20s. This was in the 70s when dialysis was just starting to become widely available, and my nan said doctors at the time told her he would be lucky to hit 40. He got a transplant pretty much immediately, but rejected it in his early 30s. During the rejection, they waited too long to put him back on dialysis, hoping the kidney would bounce back, and he had a massive stroke. After 2 years of rehab, he was left mostly paralyzed on the right side of his body but could walk with a limp and was able to do very basic tasks with the right hand, like gripping a cup. Despite this, he never complained a single day that I remember. On the contrary, he usually made tons of jokes and went out of his way to cheer people up. He also went back to working full-time as a tubist for a state-run classical brass orchestra. He had another kidney transplant in his early 50s. This one lasted for 2 years, and when it got rejected, he had a cardiac event that nearly killed him and left him with arrhythmia, so he was put on blood thinners. Shortly after this, he decided to get the cat and mostly retired. He no longer took part in concerts and the like, but still worked for the orchestra part-time, procuring, organizing, and archiving their sheet music and the like. He also broke his collarbone during a trip to Austria, which never healed due to how brittle his bones were from the long dialysis and from years of lying still for hours. His left hip was shot to hell. Again, no complaints. In April this year, he had another massive stroke that made him fade out of consciousness and finally pass within 5 days. At the time of his passing, he was one of the longest-serving dialysis patients his doctor had ever had, with a total of almost 35 years of dialysis 3 times a week. Now, why is all this important, you ask? We have a tradition in Bavaria. When a person passes, you create a sterbebee, Olchin, a little folded card that contains a picture of the disease with their date of birth and death, and a poem, Bible verse or the like, and usually a picture of a saint, flower or some such that the person would have liked. These are handed out to everybody at the funeral and sent to friends and relatives that can't attend, and you sort of collect them to look at to remember the person. Once a year on the Totensuntag, loosely translates to Sunday of the Dead, the last Sunday in November, my family will pull out a box of Sturbabilchen going back to my nan's nan, and we pull out a few at random and tell stories about them. For my dad, a very good friend of mine who is a talented artist, illustrated to very unique images. The front shows a tuba sprouting wings and floating into a beam of light. The back shows my dad riding into Bavarian heaven in the coach of death, where they have limitless white sausages, beer and pretzels. Maisie is watching them ascend. The imagery is from my pop's favorite folk theater play, Brander Casper. It's about a man who gets visited by death several times throughout his life, but each time, he isn't ready to go. He tricks death by getting him pissed drunk. Death forgets why he's even there. They party for a bit, and he leaves to return a few decades later. At the end of the piece, Casper is quite old and has lived a full and happy life. He greets death as an old friend. They have a last shot, and then they fly up into heaven together. On the inside of the card, we have the traditional picture of the deceased, and instead of a Bible verse, we picked a verse from one of my dad's favorite songs, Come Grower Schwarzervogel, Come, Big Blackbird. The song is about a man weary of life. He tries to lure death towards him, who is symbolized by a raven, and as the song goes on, he becomes impatient, opens the window, and puts a few bits of sugar on the sill. It is hauntingly beautiful and quite unsettling, which my pops loved. Unfortunately, the artist in question committed suicide later in life. When the man finally gets picked up by the raven, they fly towards heaven, and he feels an overwhelming sense of relief and freedom. The first part of the verse we picked was put into the newspaper announcement. It reads, and we will fly upwards into heaven, into a new time, into a new world. The second part that you can see in the Sturbabild reads, and I will sing, I will laugh, I will shout, you're kidding, because I will finally understand what everything is about. Last but not least, my dad loved plants, particularly wildflowers and luscious green plants. Unfortunately, I suck at gardening. I've tried to pick up a few things here and there and was able to put together an okay spread on his grave. Working on it helps me connect to my pops, and it feels like I'm doing something for him, which has been a tremendous help with the grieving process. All of the plants are bee and insect friendly. It's why he loved wildflowers, and I'm hoping to improve on it as the years go by. Story 3. I slept with 2 different women in one night. Separately, they were both named Courtney, and I met both of them in group therapy. Slept with someone from group. Flashed my tits for someone else who asked me for sex, but I didn't sleep with him. A lot of people need companionship and don't have it, and have lost those around them. Many use sex to help deal with depression or grief or mania or addiction. Convinced my ex to go cause he needed help after I left group, and he proceeded to sleep with 3 women there. Okay, buddy. Story 4. Sex in public. My and I used to take my car out to have sex at the end of this dead and road in the middle of nowhere leading to farmland that had a baseball practice field with a shed batting cage that my friend and former teammate's family owned, so it was relatively low-key and seemed like one of the safest public options when we really wanted to go at it. One night, while we were down this road, a cop rolled by and shined his spotlight into the steamed-up windows of my little 2-door Ultimate coupe. While I was sitting in the back passenger side seat with Mike sitting on my lap holding onto the passenger seat that was moved forward. There was literally no way to get in out of the back without getting out of the car and sliding past seat forward. We played dead and were freaked out knowing he'd watched us for at least a minute coming down the hill to the dead and where he needed to turn around. This wasn't the first time I'd had the cops cock-block me with her and other girls, so I was more nervous I'd be recognized and get a ticket or something for this time. To our surprise, the cop wound up leaving us be. He laughed it off, finished, when he was out of view, and then decided to never use the same place twice. No more than 3 weeks later, there was a local story in the news about some guy that was 7 to 8 years older than us that would drive downtown into city, pick up hookers, drive them almost 45 minutes to Mike and I spot, have sex with these women, kill them, and then bury their bodies right where we used to have sex. Turns out the guy had been doing this for about a year. had sex with, murdered, and then buried 7 or 8 of those prostitutes' bodies. Ultimately kind of ruined the sex in public vibe for us. Story 5. When I was 18, I was working as a phone sex operator and was introduced to sex work by a coworker. She set me up with a much older man who would pay me for sex. On weekend he wanted to do a threesome, so I talked a friend of mine into coming with me with the promise of a big payday. I made more money working for him every weekend than I ever did at the phone sex job. $1K if I stayed the weekend. $2K for the threesome. Most of the time, I would come down on Friday night and leave the next day, and he would give me $750. Story 6. I suddenly and involuntarily ejaculated at work, flooding my pants with a massive load of semen after 77 days of not jacking off. The 77th day was the day after I'd finally obtained a smartphone. This was years ago. Though I gave up jerking, I still allowed myself to look at porn, which only added to the challenge. I shared an office room with one other guy, but he wasn't there that day, so I got bored and looked at my phone for the sexy pics I'd transferred from my computer. There were some softcore nudes. I prefer stuff like 90s Playboy and swimsuit lingerie models and such on a slideshow, but only a couple seconds into it, like literally not very long at all, an image of Hooters girl Victoria Rakosa came up. If you do a Google Images search on her name, it's the photo where she's in a cyan bikini, with her head propped up against her arm. And just by looking at her, my body just decided to go for it. Not even a nude photo, and I wasn't even touching myself. My entire body suddenly shook with this thunderous orgasm. It was the most intense thing ever. But I was still very much aware that I was at work, in an office, that at the time didn't even have a door, and my back was sort of towards the entrance, so I might not have seen if someone was coming in. So I forced myself to be silent, so it was a weird silent gasp groan, as my shaking and twitching body was just unleashing a flood of cum into my boxers. As insanely pleasurable as it should have been, I was scared out of my mind, thinking it was a medical emergency. It was so thick and warm that I worried that my nuts might have imploded into a bloody mess. Thankfully, it was just semen, but it was a lot. After who knows how long, I figured I'd better get myself cleaned up. Nothing was visible outside my pants, somehow, but my boxers were totally drenched. I awkwardly made my way to the hallway where the washrooms are, which thankfully isn't too far. However, at the end of the hall, at a main intersection of the office, was the hottest woman in the office. She was waiting for somebody. She was at the far end, so I wouldn't need to walk past her to get to the men's room, but she would be close. When I got near, she looked up, said nothing, and gave me a weird inquisitive look with a raised eyebrow. Did she see my awkward walking? Did she smell me? I got cleaned up. Thankfully no one else was in there, and when I left the men's room, the hottie wasn't there. To this day, I don't know if she suspected that I had the biggest orgasm of my life right before I stumbled near her. Story 7. Okay, this is a weird one, because to this day, I'm not sure how much I've imagined or embellished over the years as a false memory, but I know the core of it is true. When I used to go to the swimming pool with my best friend, we were both like 12-13-ish. We always used the communal changing room. Can't even remember why we started doing that. One time, she kept trying to persuade me to drop my towel and show her my boobs. She dropped hers and danced around all over the changing room, and eventually, I did too, but with a little less dancing. It then became a thing for us to just casually get naked together at the pool, but nothing that I can recall ever happened beyond that. I have a vague memory of letting her touch my boobs, but it's not clear enough for me to say whether that's an embellishment. I do remember, however, being very disappointed the one time we went, and the communal room was occupied. In retrospect, I'm pretty sure she was my first bisexual awakening lol, though I didn't clock it at the time. Story 8. I guess it would be the time. I was talking to a guy who kept going hot and cold. Hadn't hooked up yet, but we hung up because he was an old friend. I went to his house, lived with his brother, to hang one night, and he acted like I wasn't even there. On my way out, his brother, who I'd never seen that way, I'm a one-at-a-time person even when single, made a very convincing pitch, so I dated him instead. No regrets. It didn't work out, but we had a good time. So I guess the answer is I made out with both brothers. Story 9. In college, I spent a lot of time in the music building for some choral stuff and piano and voice for my minor. We had 2 levels of practice rooms that had really slim windows. Most people use the upper level and the lower level only got half usage during classes. I had an ex with whom I frequently got hot and heavy both in her private practice room for pianists in a small, locked hallway. They had a half-dozen grands whose back faced the door, so if you looked over the piano, you could just see the window. And in the regular practice rooms, after we'd broken up, lights off, but that was no guarantee. There were no locks, and the hallway was bright, and the right angle would make some curious and be obvious to others. We were always super close to having sex, but usually settled for mutual masturbation with our clothes mostly open. Exciting, but an unsustainable relationship, ultimately. Later, a girlfriend, with whom I'd been intimate, but not official, and I were talking in passing time and were discussing random topics and landed on how we'd not had sex in quite a while. A few comments later, she mentioned how she was hungry, and I made some lewd comment, and next thing you know, she was giving me oral in one of the lower-level practice rooms. Lights off, of course, but super obvious. If anyone had opened the door inadvertently, we'd have been busted. It was very exciting. She was lovely and very exciting, unafraid to experiment, bold and quite frank, sexually, many of the things I desired in a significant other. But I was weeks away from graduating and moving across the country, and didn't want to leave any loose ends back home. She's fine, I'm fine. We both finally ended up quite happy with our lives. Can't speak for her, but I had a few really shitty years along the way. We interact here and there on social media, and I think of her fondly, and I hope she does the same. So things worked out in the end. Story 10. Had a three-way with Mike at the time, senior year high school, and her best friend on a baseball diamond at an elementary school. We drove out to the school to hang out and drink one night, around 9 p.m. We were all underage at the time, and one of my older friends scored me some hard off for the night, and we had nowhere to go, so we went to the school on the hill next to Mike's house. She went there as a kid. It was one of our common hangout spots. We got to the school and had a few shots, and I somehow ended up scoring a grand slam that night right there on the baseball field. It was mostly me and the other girl giving attention to Mike. When we were done, we got back to my car, and just as we all got inside, a cop car pulled up and shined its spotlight on us. Neither of them were wearing pants, but with shirts on it looked normal from the outside, through tinted windows. I got out and talked to the cop and explained that we were stargazing and that we used to go to this school and lived nearby. The cop talked to me for a few moments, then asked us to leave and drove away. If the cop had searched my car, she would have found to have naked girls and a trunk containing various bottles of liquor. I drove us all back, while being a bit drunk still. We could have gotten into so much trouble, but instead it ended up being just a fun, crazy experience.